The bucket tipped over before Nora Fenwick could catch it, and grey water spread fast across the marble floor, running straight toward the edge of the east hallway where no servant was ever allowed to stand without permission. Her hands shook as she grabbed the cloth from her apron and dropped to her knees, wiping in quick, desperate strokes. If any noble saw this mess before she cleaned it, she would lose her position before the sun went down. She had seen it happen to others. A dropped tray. A misplaced word. A door left open a moment too long. The palace did not forgive mistakes, and it never explained why. She worked faster, pressing the cloth against the stone, praying that no footsteps would come around the corner. The east hallway led toward the private chambers of the royal family, and beyond that, toward the great doors of the council hall, where the most powerful people in the kingdom made decisions that shaped the lives of thousands. Nora had never once been allowed past the second pillar. She was not important enough to walk where kings and ministers walked. She was important enough only to clean the floor they walked on. The water finally soaked into her cloth, and she sat back on her heels, breathing hard. Her knees ached from hours of kneeling, and her fingers had gone raw from the cold stone. She was 17 years old, though sometimes she felt much older, worn down by years of work that never seemed to end. She had come to the palace 3 winters ago, after her mother passed away in their small village near the northern hills. There had been no one left to care for her, and a distant cousin had arranged for her to take a position in the royal kitchens. It was not a kind gift. It was simply the only door that opened. She missed her mother every single day, but she missed her most in quiet moments like this one, when her hands were busy and her mind had room to wander. Her mother used to sing while she walked, soft songs about rivers and mountains and people who traveled far from home but always found their way back. Nora had learned every one of those songs by heart, though she rarely let herself sing them out loud. Servants who drew attention to themselves did not last long in the palace. She had learned that lesson quickly, from watching others make the mistake of standing out. A door opened somewhere down the hall, and Nora froze, her hand still pressed against the damp stone. Footsteps approached, slow and steady, the sound of boots rather than soft indoor shoes. She kept her head down, staring at the floor, hoping whoever it was would simply walk past without noticing her. The footsteps stopped just beside her. She recognized the boots before she dared to look up. They belonged to Edwin Hale, one of the younger palace guards, a quiet man who rarely spoke to anyone below his rank. He was tall, with short brown hair and a serious face that gave away nothing of what he was thinking. Nora had passed him in the halls many times, but they had never exchanged more than a nod. "You should not be cleaning this close to the private wing," he said, his voice low. "I know," Nora answered quickly. The bucket tipped. "I am almost finished. I will be gone in a moment." He studied her for a long second, and Nora braced herself for a warning, or worse, a report to the head housekeeper. Instead, he simply nodded once and continued walking, his footsteps fading down the corridor toward the council hall. Nora let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She gathered her supplies quickly, wringing out the cloth and setting the bucket upright before hurrying back toward the servants' stairs. Her heart still pounded from the encounter, though nothing had truly happened. That was the strange thing about life in the palace. Every small moment felt like it carried the weight of something much larger, as if one wrong step could unravel everything she had built for herself, fragile as it was. Down in the kitchen, the air was thick with steam and the smell of roasting meat. Cooks shouted orders across long wooden tables, and younger servants darted between them carrying trays and baskets. Nora slipped into the corner where the other scullery maids worked, taking her place beside a girl named Ivy, who glanced at her with raised eyebrows. "You look like you saw a ghost," Ivy said, scrubbing a large pot with practiced speed. "I nearly got caught near the private wing," Nora admitted, keeping her voice low so the head cook would not hear. "A guard found me instead of anyone important. I think I am safe." Ivy shook her head, though there was sympathy in her expression. "You are always closer to trouble than the rest of us. I do not know how you manage it." Nora did not have an answer for that. It was true that her tasks often took her farther into the palace than most of the other maids, simply because she worked quickly and did not complain, which made the housekeeper trust her with more difficult chores. It was meant to be a compliment, though it often felt like a curse, since it placed her nearer to the parts of the palace where servants were least welcome. The hours passed in their usual rhythm. Nora scrubbed pots, carried water, swept ash from the fireplaces, and helped prepare trays for the evening meal. She rarely had a moment to sit, and by the time the last dishes were cleared, her arms ached and her eyes felt heavy. She was grateful, at least, for the simple comfort of a warm kitchen and a roof over her head. Many people in the kingdom did not have even that. That night, as she lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, she allowed herself a rare private moment. The room was dark, and the other girls around her were already asleep, their breathing slow and even. Nora closed her eyes and let her mother's voice fill her memory, the gentle melody of an old song about a traveler returning home after many years away. She hummed it softly under her breath, barely louder than a whisper, feeling the familiar comfort settle over her like a blanket. She did not know that, less than a day later, that same quiet habit would carry her voice through the halls of the palace in a way she never intended. The next morning began earlier than usual. Nora was woken before sunrise by the head housekeeper, a stern woman named Mistress Coat, who informed her that she had been assigned to the upper corridors for the day. Nora's stomach tightened at the news. The upper corridors led directly past the council hall, the most restricted and closely watched part of the entire palace. "Why me?" Nora asked, though she knew better than to argue. "Because you work quietly and quickly, and today the council meets on a matter of great importance," Mistress Coat said. "The floors must be spotless before they arrive, and you will not be seen or heard. Do you understand?" "Yes, mistress." "Good. Finish before the second bell, and do not linger." Nora nodded and gathered her supplies, her hands trembling slightly as she climbed the servants' stairs toward the upper level. She had cleaned near the council hall only a handful of times before, always early in the morning, always alone, always careful to disappear before anyone of importance arrived. This time felt different, though she could not explain why. Perhaps it was simply the seriousness in Mistress Coat's voice, or the quiet tension she noticed among the other servants that morning, as if everyone in the palace sensed that something significant was about to happen. She reached the long marble corridor just as the first light of dawn spilled through the tall windows, painting the floor in soft gold. The corridor was empty, silent except for the distant sound of birds outside. Nora set down her bucket and began to walk, moving methodically from one end of the hallway to the other, her cloth gliding across the smooth stone. As she walked, her mind wandered back to her mother, as it often did in quiet moments. She thought of the old songs, the gentle melodies that had once filled their small home in the northern hills. Without meaning to, she began to hum, softly at first, then a little louder as she lost herself in the rhythm of her work. The corridor felt empty and far removed from the rest of the palace, and for a brief moment, Nora forgot the rules that governed every part of her life. She did not notice the tall wooden doors of the council hall standing slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. She did not know that inside, the council had paused their session early, several members stepping into the outer chamber to speak quietly among themselves before the main discussion resumed. She did not know that her voice, soft as it was, would travel farther than she ever intended. By the time she reached the final stretch of floor near those doors, her humming had grown into something closer to singing, a full melody carried gently on her breath. It was the song her mother used to sing about the traveler returning home, a song of hope after long years of hardship. Nora sang it without thinking, her voice quiet but clear, filling the empty space around her with warmth. She did not see the shadow that appeared behind the doors, nor did she hear the sudden stillness that fell over the room beyond. She simply finished the verse, wrung out her cloth, and reached for her bucket, ready to move on to the next section of hallway. It was only when she stood that she noticed the doors were no longer closed. They stood wide open, and several figures in formal council robes stood just beyond the threshold, perfectly still, staring directly at her. Nora's breath caught in her throat. Her bucket slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a dull, hollow sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Nora stood frozen in place, certain that she had just made the single greatest mistake of her entire life, uncertain whether the next word she heard would end her position in the palace forever, or something far worse. The silence stretched on so long that Nora began to count her own heartbeats, each one pounding harder than the last. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, too afraid to look up at the faces watching her. She could feel their attention pressing against her like a physical weight, and every instinct told her to run, though her legs refused to move. A man's voice finally broke the stillness. It was calm, deep, and carried the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Do not move," he said. Nora's breath caught again, and she forced herself to remain exactly where she stood, her hands trembling at her sides. She heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, the sound of fine leather shoes against marble. She kept her gaze low, staring at the hem of a deep blue robe as it stopped just in front of her. "Look at me," the voice said. Slowly, painfully, Nora lifted her eyes. Before her stood an older man with silver hair and sharp, thoughtful eyes, dressed in the formal robes of a senior council member. She recognized him immediately, though she had never stood this close to him before. Lord Adric Whitmore was one of the most respected men in the kingdom, a trusted advisor who had served under two different rulers. His expression was unreadable, neither angry nor kind, simply intensely focused, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly appeared in front of him. "What is your name?" he asked. "Nora, my lord. Nora Fenwick." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "And that song you were singing, Nora Fenwick. Where did you learn it?" Nora blinked, confused by the question. She had expected accusations, threats, perhaps immediate dismissal from her position. She had not expected curiosity. "From my mother, my lord. She used to sing it when I was small. I did not know anyone could hear me. I am sorry. I will never do it again." Lord Whitmore did not respond right away. Instead, he turned slightly and looked back toward the open doors of the council hall, where several other robed figures still stood in stunned silence, watching the exchange. One of them, a woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight braid, stepped forward with an expression Nora could not quite understand. It looked almost like grief, though her eyes were dry. "Sing it again," the woman said quietly. "From the beginning, if you can." Nora's heart nearly stopped. "My lady, I do not think I am permitted to." "You have my permission," Lord Whitmore interrupted, his voice gentler now. "Please." "From the beginning." Nora glanced between the two of them, utterly unsure of what was happening or why two of the kingdom's most powerful people were asking a scullery maid to sing in the middle of a council session. Every instinct screamed at her that this was some kind of trap, a test she could not possibly pass. But refusing an order from Lord Whitmore seemed far more dangerous than obeying it, so she took a shaky breath, closed her eyes for just a moment, and began again. Her voice trembled at first, thin and uncertain, but as she settled into the familiar melody, something inside her steadied. She thought of her mother's face, the warmth of their small home, the comfort of a song sung 1,000 times before. By the second verse, her voice had grown clearer, filling the corridor with the same gentle warmth it had carried only minutes earlier, though now every word felt heavier, watched by people who held the fate of the entire kingdom in their hands. When she finished, the silence that followed was different from before. It was not shocked or tense. It felt almost sorrowful, as though the song had opened something in the room that no one had touched in a very long time. The woman with the silver-streaked braid pressed a hand to her chest and turned away briefly, composing herself before speaking again. "That was my mother's song," she said softly. "I have not heard it sung properly in 20 years. Where did you say you learned it?" "From my own mother, my lady," Nora answered, still trembling. "She came from the northern hills. She always said the song traveled with her family for many generations." "The northern hills," Lord Whitmore repeated thoughtfully, exchanging a glance with the woman beside him. "That would explain it. Songs travel strange distances in this kingdom, carried by people no one remembers to ask about." Nora had no idea what he meant, but she did not dare ask. She simply stood, waiting, unsure whether she had somehow helped herself or made things far worse. A third figure emerged from the council hall, a younger man with a serious expression and neatly combed dark hair, dressed in robes that marked him as a junior member of the council. He looked between Nora and the two senior members with obvious confusion. "My lord, the session is set to resume. Shall I ask the maid to leave?" Lord Whitmore considered this for a moment, his sharp eyes studying Nora carefully, as if weighing something far beyond the simple question of whether a servant should be dismissed. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I believe we will delay the session a little longer. Nora Fenwick, you will come inside with us." Nora's stomach dropped. "Inside the council hall, my lord. I am only a kitchen maid. I do not belong." "You will come inside," he repeated, more firmly this time, though not unkindly. "There are matters here that concern you more than you realize, and I would rather explain them properly than leave you standing in a hallway wondering what you have done wrong." Nora glanced helplessly toward the woman beside him, hoping for some sign of reassurance, but the woman only gave a small, tired smile and gestured toward the open doors. "It is all right," the woman said. "No harm will come to you. I promise you that." With no other choice available to her, Nora left her bucket and cloth abandoned on the marble floor and followed the two council members through the tall wooden doors, her heart pounding with every step. The council hall stretched before her, far larger and grander than she had ever imagined, with high-arched windows letting in streams of morning light, long tables covered in maps and documents, and rows of empty chairs where the rest of the council members had already risen to their feet, watching her enter with expressions ranging from curiosity to open astonishment. Near the head of the room, seated in a chair slightly larger and more ornate than the others, sat a woman Nora recognized instantly from portraits displayed throughout the palace. Queen Isolde herself, dressed simply for the morning session, her expression calm but deeply attentive as she watched the young scullery maid walk hesitantly into the room where the future of the kingdom was decided. "So," the queen said quietly, her voice carrying easily across the hall despite its softness, "this is the girl whose voice stopped an entire council mid-session." Nora dropped into the deepest curtsy she had ever performed, her legs shaking so badly she feared she might fall. "Your Majesty, I did not mean to disturb anyone. I thought the hallway was empty. I am truly sorry for any trouble I have caused." "You have caused no trouble," Queen Isolde said, rising slowly from her chair. "You have, in fact, reminded this council of something we very much needed to remember." Nora kept her eyes lowered, utterly bewildered by the strange turn her ordinary morning had taken. She had entered the palace that day expecting nothing more than another long shift of scrubbing floors and carrying water. Instead, she now stood in the very heart of the kingdom's power, surrounded by people whose decisions shaped the lives of everyone she had ever known, and she had no understanding at all of why her small, private song had mattered enough to bring their important business to a complete stop. Queen Isolde stepped closer, studying Nora's face with an intensity that made the young maid's skin prickle. "Tell me, child," the queen said softly, "do you know the story behind that song you were singing? Do you know why it means so much to the people gathered in this room?" Nora shook her head slowly. "No, Your Majesty. It was only ever my mother's song to me. A song about someone finding their way home." A quiet murmur passed through the gathered council members, and Lord Whitmore exchanged another meaningful glance with Queen Isolde, as though confirming something they had both silently suspected the moment Nora had begun to sing. "Then perhaps," the queen said gently, "it is time you learned the truth of where that song came from, and why it matters far more than you could possibly imagine." Queen Isolde gestured for Nora to sit, and though every instinct told the young maid that servants did not sit in the presence of a queen, she lowered herself onto the edge of a chair near the long council table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The other council members remained standing, forming a loose half-circle around her, their expressions no longer suspicious but deeply curious, even gentle in a way Nora had never experienced from anyone of such high rank. 20 years ago, Queen Isolde began, this kingdom lost someone very dear to it. My younger brother, Prince Callum, disappeared during a journey through the northern hills when he was barely more than a boy. He had gone to visit villages along the border, learning the customs of the common people before he was meant to take on greater responsibilities within the court. He never returned. Nora's chest tightened as she listened, though she still did not understand what any of this had to do with her. Search parties combed the hills for months, the queen continued, her voice steady despite the old sorrow clearly still living beneath it. We found no trace of him. Eventually, the search was called off, though I never accepted that he was gone. I always believed, foolishly perhaps, that he had simply lost his way and found shelter somewhere among the villages, choosing a quiet life over the burdens of the crown. Lord Whitmore stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. The song you sang, Nora, was written many years before the prince's disappearance, but after he vanished, it took on new meaning among the people of this court. It became known as a song of hope for those who wandered far from home, a promise that even the longest journey could end in return. Very few people outside this palace still remember its true origin. Fewer still sing it the way you did today, with the old northern phrasing exactly as it was first written. Nora's mind raced, piecing together fragments of memory. Her mother had always been secretive about her past, rarely speaking of her childhood or the family she had left behind in the northern hills. She had died before ever explaining why she guarded those details so carefully, and Nora had long assumed it was simply grief, the kind that made people avoid painful memories. "My lady," Nora said carefully, turning to the woman with the silver-streaked braid, whom she now understood must hold some important position within the court, "may I ask who you are? You said the song belonged to your mother as well." The woman offered a small, sad smile. "My name is Lady Beatrice Hollis. I served as a companion to the Queen's mother for many years, and before that, I grew up in a village not far from where the prince was said to have vanished. That song was sung in every home in that region. It was not unusual for it to travel from family to family, carried by anyone who passed through." Queen Isolde studied Nora with an expression that mixed hope and hesitation. "Tell me about your mother, Nora. Everything you remember. Her name, where she was born, anything at all she might have told you about her early life." Nora hesitated, unused to being asked such personal questions by anyone, let alone a queen. "Her name was Elsie Fenwick, Your Majesty. She rarely spoke of her childhood. I only knew she came from somewhere in the northern hills before she married my father and settled in our village. She passed away 3 winters ago, from a long illness that the local healer could not cure." A strange stillness fell over the room. Queen Isolde's eyes glistened, though she blinked the emotion away quickly, straightening her posture as though forcing herself back into composure. "Elsie," she repeated softly. "That name is not unfamiliar to me, though it has been so many years since I last heard it spoken." "Your Majesty," Lord Whitmore said gently, "we should be careful not to draw conclusions too quickly. Many families in that region share similar names and similar songs. It may simply be a coincidence." "Perhaps," the Queen said, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe it. "But coincidence or not, this girl deserves more than a hurried conversation and a return to her scrubbing brush. I want to understand more about her mother's history, and I want it done with patience and care, not haste." Nora felt her face flush with embarrassment and confusion. She had never imagined that her mother's quiet, ordinary life might hold some connection to the royal family, and the idea felt almost impossible to accept. "Your Majesty, forgive me, but I do not see how my mother could be connected to anything so important. She was simply a village woman. She cooked, she sewed, she sang songs to comfort me when I was frightened of storms. There was nothing remarkable about her at all." "Sometimes," Lady Beatrice said softly, "the most remarkable people spend their lives appearing entirely ordinary, especially when they wish to protect themselves or those they love from attention they did not want." The words settled over Nora like a weight she did not know how to carry. She thought of her mother's occasional silences, the way she sometimes stared out the window as if remembering something she never spoke of, the way she flinched slightly whenever travelers passed through their village asking questions about people from the northern hills. Nora had always assumed it was simple shyness. Now she wondered if it had been something closer to fear. Queen Isolde turned to address the full council, her voice regaining the authority Nora had witnessed only briefly before it softened into personal grief. "This session will resume this afternoon. In the meantime, I want Nora Fenwick moved to more comfortable quarters within the palace, and I want Lady Beatrice to begin gathering whatever records exist regarding families from the northern hills during the years surrounding my brother's disappearance. This may lead nowhere. It may simply be an old song passed down through unrelated families. But I will not ignore even the smallest possibility of an answer after 20 years of silence." Several council members exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unaccustomed to matters of the heart interrupting matters of state, but none of them dared question the Queen's decision aloud. Lord Whitmore nodded respectfully and turned to Nora with an expression that was almost kind. "You will not return to your usual duties for now," he said. "Do not be frightened. Nothing about this means you are in trouble. If anything, you may have brought this court closer to answers we stopped hoping to find many years ago. Nora did not know how to respond. She had walked into the palace that morning as an invisible servant, someone whose presence barely registered to the people she cleaned for. Within a single hour, she found herself seated among the most powerful figures in the kingdom, being told that her mother, a simple woman who had spent her life quietly raising a daughter in a small northern village, might somehow be connected to a prince who vanished 2 decades earlier. A young attendant was summoned to escort Nora from the council hall, guiding her through unfamiliar corridors toward a modest but far more comfortable room than she had ever occupied before. The walls were paneled in warm wood, and a real bed with clean linen sat beneath a window overlooking one of the palace gardens. Nora sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her own trembling hands, trying to process everything that had just happened. She thought of Ivy back in the kitchens, likely wondering why Nora had not returned for the midday meal preparation. She thought of Mistress Colt, who would surely demand an explanation for her sudden disappearance from ordinary duties. Most of all, she thought of her mother, wishing desperately that she could ask her the questions that now burned in her mind. Had she truly come from a family connected to the crown? Had she known someone important, perhaps even the missing prince himself? Why had she never spoken of any of it, not even once, in all the years Nora had known her? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Lady Beatrice entered quietly, carrying a small wooden box under one arm. She sat beside Nora on the edge of the bed, her expression gentle. "I know this must feel overwhelming," Lady Beatrice said. "You came to this palace as a maid, and within a single morning, your entire understanding of your own family has been called into question. I am sorry for the confusion this has caused you." "I do not understand any of it," Nora admitted quietly. "I only sang because I thought no one could hear me. I never meant for any of this to happen." "Sometimes the things we do not mean to happen turn out to matter the most," Lady Beatrice said, opening the small wooden box she carried. Inside lay a collection of old letters, their edges worn and yellowed with age. These belonged to families from the Northern Hills who once had connections to the royal court, gathered many years ago when the search for Prince Callum was still active. "I thought perhaps, together, we might look through them for any mention of your mother's family." Nora reached hesitantly for one of the letters, her fingers brushing against the fragile paper. As she unfolded it carefully, she noticed handwriting that seemed strangely familiar, a particular slant to certain letters that reminded her instantly of notes her mother used to leave for her before Nora had learned to read very well. "This handwriting," Nora whispered, her voice catching. "I think I recognize it." Lady Beatrice leaned closer, examining the letter with sudden intensity. "Read it aloud, if you are able. Every detail may matter." Nora's hands trembled as she began to read, her voice growing quieter with every line, the words on the page slowly reshaping everything she thought she knew about the mother she had loved and lost, and about the strange, tangled path that had somehow led a simple scullery maid into the very heart of a mystery the entire kingdom had long since given up on solving. The letter spoke of a young woman named Elsie who had once served as a companion to a noble family living near the border of the Northern Hills, a family closely tied to the crown through old friendship rather than blood. It mentioned a summer when Prince Callum had stayed briefly with that same family during his travels, learning songs and stories from the people who lived far from the comforts of the palace. It said nothing certain, nothing that proved any direct connection, but it planted a seed of possibility that neither Nora nor Lady Beatrice could ignore. News of the morning's events did not stay contained within the council hall for long. By the time the sun reached its highest point, whispers had already begun spreading through every corridor of the palace, carried by servants who had seen Nora escorted to new quarters, and by council members who could not resist sharing the strange tale over their midday meals. Within a single day, the scullery maid who sang in an empty hallway had become the most discussed topic in the entire royal household. Not everyone welcomed the change. In the servants' quarters, Ivy found herself fielding endless questions from the other kitchen staff, none of whom she could satisfy since she understood the situation no better than they did. She only went up to clean the corridor, Ivy told them repeatedly. "I do not know why she has not come back." Among the higher ranks of the court, the reaction proved far more complicated. Some nobles found the story charming, even romantic, a tale of a hidden connection finally brought into the light after 20 years of grief. They spoke of Nora with warmth, suggesting she be given a formal position within the palace, perhaps as a companion to the queen or a singer for important court occasions. Others viewed the entire matter with deep suspicion, unwilling to accept that a common scullery maid might hold any true connection to the missing prince or the noble families surrounding him. Among those who viewed the situation with the greatest unease was Councillor Rutherford Vane, a senior member of the court known for his careful, calculating nature. He had built much of his influence over the past decade by positioning himself as the Queen's most trusted advisor on matters of succession and inheritance, and the sudden appearance of a girl with a possible, however distant, connection to the royal bloodline threatened the careful balance he had spent years arranging. If Nora's lineage proved to hold any weight at all, questions would inevitably arise about old alliances, old promises, and old debts that Councillor Vane had long assumed were safely buried in the past. That evening, Vane requested a private audience with Lord Whitmore, choosing his words carefully as they walked together through one of the quieter palace gardens. "I understand the Queen's excitement," Vane said, his tone measured and calm, though something sharper lingered beneath it. After so many years without answers regarding her brother, any thread of hope must feel precious. But we must consider what happens if this thread leads nowhere, or worse, if it leads somewhere inconvenient. A scullery maid suddenly elevated on the strength of an old song and a handful of yellowed letters could easily become a source of embarrassment for this court, or a target for those who wish to see the crown weakened. Lord Whitmore listened carefully, his expression unreadable. "You believe the investigation should be stopped?" "I believe it should proceed with far greater caution," Vane replied. "And I believe the girl herself should be watched closely. We know very little about her, after all, beyond the fact that she happens to sing a particular song rather well." Lord Whitmore did not respond immediately, choosing his words with the same deliberate care he applied to every matter of state. "The Queen has made her wishes clear. I do not intend to obstruct her search for answers regarding her brother, regardless of where those answers may lead." Vane offered a thin, polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course. I only wish to ensure that caution accompanies hope, as it always should in matters concerning the crown." Though the conversation ended there, Vane did not abandon his concerns so easily. Over the following days, he began making quiet inquiries of his own, seeking any information that might discredit Nora's story or cast doubt on her sudden importance within the palace. He found little of substance, since Nora herself had no knowledge of any hidden connections, and her mother had passed away without leaving behind any clear answers. Frustrated by the lack of useful information, Vane began considering other means of protecting his position. Meanwhile, Nora struggled to adjust to her strange new circumstances. She was given lighter duties, mostly assisting Lady Beatrice in reviewing old records and occasionally singing for members of the court who wished to hear the song that had caused such a stir. Though many treated her with genuine warmth, she remained acutely aware of the whispers that followed her through the halls, some admiring, others deeply skeptical. Among the servants, resentment simmered quietly beneath the surface. A young maid named Prudence, who had long competed with Nora for extra duties and small favors from the head housekeeper, watched the sudden change in Nora's circumstances with growing bitterness. Prudence had worked in the palace nearly as long as Nora, yet she had never received even a moment of attention from anyone above the rank of assistant cook. Watching Nora dine in comfortable quarters and speak with council members felt like an unbearable injustice, regardless of how it had come about. "She probably arranged the entire thing," Prudence muttered to another servant one evening, scrubbing pots with unusual force. Singing in an empty hallway, conveniently loud enough for the council to hear through open doors. "It is far too convenient to be an accident." "You truly believe she planned it?" the other servant asked, unconvinced. "I believe opportunities like that do not simply fall into the laps of people who do nothing to seek them," Prudence replied sharply. Word of Prudence's grumbling eventually reached Councillor Vane through one of his many quiet sources within the palace staff. Recognizing an opportunity, Vane arranged a private meeting with the young maid, offering sympathy for her frustrations and gently suggesting that perhaps the truth of Nora's sudden rise deserved closer examination. He did not ask Prudence to do anything improper, not directly. He simply planted small suggestions, carefully worded, that left the impression Nora might not be as innocent as the Queen believed. A few days later, a valuable silver hairpin belonging to Lady Beatrice went missing from her private chambers. It was a small, unremarkable disappearance under ordinary circumstances, the kind of minor theft that occurred occasionally within any large household. But this time, an anonymous note reached the head housekeeper, suggesting that the new girl given special privileges within the palace might know more about the missing item than she claimed. Nora learned of the accusation when Mistress Court summoned her unexpectedly, her expression grim and disapproving. "A serious matter has come to my attention," the housekeeper said, her voice cold. "Lady Beatrice's hairpin has gone missing, and questions have been raised regarding your sudden access to areas of the palace you were never permitted to enter before." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. "I have touched nothing that does not belong to me. I would never take anything, especially not from Lady Beatrice, who has shown me nothing but kindness." "That may be true," Mistress Court said, though her tone suggested doubt rather than reassurance, "but the accusation has been made, and it must be investigated properly before this matter can be dismissed." Nora's heart pounded with a fear far different from the terror she had felt standing before the council just days earlier. That fear had come from uncertainty about the unknown. This fear came from something far more familiar and far more painful, the fear of being blamed for something she had not done, with no way to prove her innocence beyond her own word, which suddenly felt like it carried very little weight at all. As the news of the accusation spread through the palace, the warmth many had shown Nora over the previous days cuddled quickly into suspicion. Some who had celebrated her possible connection to the royal family now whispered that perhaps she had always intended to use that connection for personal gain. Others suggested the entire situation, the song, the letters, the sudden elevation, had been nothing more than an elaborate scheme from the very beginning. Nora found herself isolated within the very palace that had, only days before, seemed on the verge of embracing her as something more than an ordinary servant. She sat alone in her borrowed quarters that evening, staring at the small wooden box of letters Lady Beatrice had left with her, wondering if everything that had happened since that morning in the hallway was about to collapse entirely, taking with it not only her fragile hope of understanding her mother's past, but her position within the palace altogether. A soft knock at her door interrupted her troubled thoughts. She opened it cautiously to find Edwin Hale standing in the corridor, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "I heard what happened," he said quietly. "I do not believe the accusation against you, and I do not think you should face this alone." Nora studied him carefully, uncertain whether to trust this sudden concern from a guard she barely knew. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." Edwin hesitated before answering. "Because I was the one who found you in the hallway that first morning, before any of this began. I watched you clean quietly and carefully, never once complaining, never once taking anything that did not belong to you. Whatever is happening now, I do not believe it reflects who you truly are." For the first time since the accusation had reached her, Nora felt a small flicker of hope. "If you believe I am innocent, then perhaps you can help me understand who truly wishes to see me blamed for something I never did." Edwin nodded slowly, glancing down the empty corridor before lowering his voice further. "I have heard certain things," whispered among the guards who watched the upper halls. "Things that suggest this accusation did not arise on its own. If you are willing, I believe we might be able to uncover the truth together, before this matter costs you everything you have only just begun to gain." Nora agreed without hesitation, though she had no idea where such an effort might lead. Edwin explained that he had overheard two guards discussing a private meeting between Councillor Vane and a young kitchen maid, held quietly in one of the palace gardens several days earlier. The details were vague, but the timing struck Edwin as suspicious, occurring shortly before the anonymous note reached the head housekeeper. "Prudence," Nora said quietly, the name settling into place like the final piece of a troubling puzzle. "We have never been close, but I never imagined she would go so far as to accuse me of theft." "Perhaps she did not act entirely on her own," Edwin suggested. "If Councillor Vane spoke with her beforehand, it is possible she was encouraged towards suspicion rather than acting from malice alone." The following morning, Nora requested a private audience with Lady Beatrice, explaining everything Edwin had shared with her the night before. Lady Beatrice listened with growing concern, her expression hardening as the pieces began to align with certain observations she herself had quietly noted over recent days, including Councillor Vane's persistent questions regarding Nora's background and his subtle suggestions that the investigation into her mother's history be handled with far greater restriction. "If this proves true," Lady Beatrice said gravely, It would mean a senior member of this council attempted to manipulate a servant into damaging the reputation of an innocent girl, simply to protect his own position within the court. That is no small matter. Together, they brought their concerns to Queen Isolde, who listened without interruption, her expression growing colder with every detail Lady Beatrice provided. When the account finished, the Queen sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment before speaking. "Bring Prudence to me directly," she said finally. Quietly, and without alarming the rest of the household. "I wish to hear the truth from her own lips before any further action is taken." Prudence arrived within the hour, visibly frightened to find herself summoned before the Queen without any explanation. Her hands shook as she curtsied deeply, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. "I understand you reported concerns regarding a missing hairpin belonging to Lady Beatrice," Queen Isolde said, her tone measured but firm. "I wish to know exactly how you came to suspect Nora Fenwick of taking it." Prudence hesitated, her composure crumbling under the weight of the Queen's steady gaze. "Your Majesty, I only repeated what I had come to believe was likely true. I never claimed to have witnessed anything myself." "And who encouraged you toward that belief?" the Queen pressed gently, though there was no mistaking the seriousness beneath her calm tone. Tears welled in Prudence's eyes as the truth finally spilled out. She explained, haltingly at first, then with growing urgency, how Councillor Vane had approached her privately, expressing sympathy for her years of unnoticed service while gently suggesting that Nora's sudden rise seemed suspicious, perhaps even calculated. He had never directly instructed her to spread false accusations, but his careful words had planted doubt that Prudence, in her own resentment and confusion, had allowed to grow into something far more damaging than he had ever explicitly requested. "I never saw her take anything," Prudence admitted through tears. "I only wanted someone to notice me the way everyone suddenly noticed her. I am sorry, Your Majesty. I never meant for it to go so far." Queen Isolde regarded the young maid with a complicated mixture of disappointment and understanding. "Jealousy is a common weakness among us all, Prudence, but allowing it to harm an innocent person is a serious failing that cannot go unaddressed. However, I recognize that you were guided toward this mistake by someone who should have known far better than to manipulate a frightened young servant for his own political protection." Later that same day, Councillor Vane was summoned before the Queen and the full council to answer for his actions. Faced with Prudence's testimony and the quiet observations Lady Beatrice had gathered over recent days, Vane attempted at first to deny any wrongdoing, insisting he had only expressed reasonable caution regarding an unverified claim of royal connection. But his careful words could not withstand the mounting evidence against him, and eventually, he was forced to admit that he had indeed hoped to discredit Nora before her possible connection to the crown could complicate the careful arrangements he had built over many years of service. "You sought to protect your own position by destroying the reputation of a girl who had done nothing more than sing a song she learned from her mother," Queen Isolde said, her voice cold with barely restrained anger. "Whatever concerns you held regarding matters of succession or inheritance, they did not grant you the right to manipulate an innocent servant or threaten the well-being of another innocent girl who trusted your position enough to be swayed by your suggestions." Councillor Vane was stripped of his advisory role that same afternoon, though the Queen, mindful of his years of otherwise loyal service, allowed him to retain a lesser position within the court rather than face complete removal from royal service. It was, Lady Beatrice later explained to Nora, a fitting balance between justice and mercy, the kind of careful judgment that had long defined Queen Isolde's rule. With the false accusation cleared and her innocence firmly established, Nora found herself once again welcomed throughout the palace, though this time the warmth extended toward her felt steadier, built on genuine respect rather than fleeting curiosity. Prudence, humbled by the consequences of her actions, approached Nora privately several days later, offering a quiet, sincere apology that Nora accepted with more grace than many might have shown in her position. "I understand what it feels like to go unnoticed," Nora told her gently. "I do not hold this against you. I only hope you find recognition through your own honest efforts, rather than through anyone else's misfortune." Meanwhile, the investigation into Nora's family history continued with renewed determination, no longer hindered by Vane's quiet interference. Lady Beatrice and Lord Whitmore worked carefully through the remaining letters and records, eventually uncovering a detailed account from an elderly caretaker who had once served the noble family mentioned in the earliest letter Nora had read. The caretaker, now retired to a quiet village near the palace, confirmed that a young woman named Elsie had indeed formed a close friendship with Prince Callum during his brief stay in the Northern Hills, and that the two had exchanged letters for some time afterward, though the correspondence had stopped abruptly following the prince's disappearance. The caretaker's account did not reveal what had ultimately happened to Prince Callum, and the mystery of his disappearance remained unsolved even after everything Nora's arrival had uncovered. But it confirmed, beyond reasonable doubt, that Elsie Fenwick had once shared a genuine friendship with the missing prince, close enough that she had likely been among the last people to receive any word from him before he vanished entirely. Queen Isolde received this news with quiet, tearful relief, grateful at last for even a small piece of understanding regarding her brother's final days, though the larger mystery of his fate remained unresolved. She summoned Nora once more, this time not within the formal setting of the council hall, but in her own private study, where the atmosphere felt far warmer and more personal. "I cannot know for certain what became of my brother," the queen said softly, "but I am grateful beyond words to know that in his final days of freedom, he found friendship with someone as gentle and kind as your mother must have been. It brings me a measure of peace I did not expect to find after all these years." Nora, moved deeply by the queen's words, found herself blinking back tears of her own. "I wish I could tell you more, Your Majesty. I wish my mother had lived long enough to share these memories herself." Perhaps, Queen Isolde said gently, she chose to keep them quiet out of her own grief, unwilling to reopen a wound that never fully healed. Grief often teaches us silence, even when we long to speak. In the weeks that followed, Nora's life within the palace changed in ways she could never have imagined during her years of quiet, unnoticed work in the kitchens. Though she held no formal noble title, Queen Isolde granted her a permanent position within the royal household as a companion to Lady Beatrice, along with the honor of performing traditional songs from the Northern Hills during important court gatherings, ensuring that the old melodies, and the memories they carried, would never again fade into silence. She did not forget where she came from, however. She insisted on maintaining a friendship with Ivy and the other kitchen staff, often visiting the kitchens during quiet hours to help with simple tasks, much to Mistress Coates' initial confusion and eventual quiet approval. She made a point of speaking kindly to every servant she passed in the halls, remembering clearly how it felt to be overlooked, and determined never to make anyone else feel invisible the way she once had. Edwin Hale, whose quiet courage had helped uncover the truth behind the false accusation against her, became a steady presence in her new life, their friendship growing slowly and naturally through shared conversations during quiet evenings in the palace gardens. Neither rushed toward anything more than genuine companionship, content instead to build something honest and lasting, free from the pressures and suspicions that had once surrounded Nora's sudden rise within the court. Months later, on a quiet afternoon much like the one that had changed everything, Nora found herself once again walking through the same marble corridor where her voice had first carried through open doors. She paused near the very spot where her bucket had once slipped from her trembling hands, remembering vividly the fear that had gripped her that morning, certain she had made an unforgivable mistake. She smiled softly at the memory, grateful now for the strange, winding path that single moment of forgetfulness had set into motion. She thought of her mother, wishing once again that she could share every detail of the incredible journey that had unfolded since that ordinary morning, though she carried a quiet comfort in believing her mother somehow knew, wherever she now rested, that her daughter had finally found a place where her voice, and her true self, no longer needed to remain hidden. As she continued down the familiar corridor, Nora began to hum softly under her breath, no longer afraid of being heard. The melody drifted through the palace halls exactly as it had once before, though this time, instead of silence and fear, it was met only with the warm, familiar smiles of those who had come to know her, and to genuinely care for the young woman whose simple, honest song had once stopped an entire royal council in its tracks, and changed the course of her life forever.